So this is a joint authored paper, and we'll do something of a double act in presenting it. So I'll present the first half and then pass over to Robert for the second part. So in this talk, we consider the relation between love and works. Is it essential for love to express itself in certain actions toward the beloved? Or is love an attitude that can or should bear no relation to works? Can our love have an object but no aim? And our focus here in asking these questions is on neighbor love. Behind the central question whether love is an attitude that can or should bear no relation to works is the question of whether love is fundamentally a matter of respect or care. And this issue has already come up in our conversations earlier. So we'll address these questions by looking at the work of David Velleman on the one hand, and of Søren Kierkegaard and K.E. Løgstrup on the other. Central to this issue is the problem of encroachment. In caring for the beloved, is it possible to avoid encroaching on them? David Velleman has argued that a condition of healthy love is that it does not encroach upon its object. So here's something he writes in the paper, Love as a Moral Emotion. Of course, there are occasions for pleasing and impressing the people one loves, just as there are occasions for caring and sharing. But someone whose love was a bundle of these urges to care and share and please and impress, such a lover would be an interfering, ingratiating nightmare. Moved by considerations of that kind, some philosophers sever any essential connection between love and care in the sense of seeking another's good. So on Velleman's own Kantian account, love stands in very close proximity to respect. So conceived, love is, as he puts it, essentially an attitude toward the beloved himself, but not toward any result at all. So in such views, love has an object, but not an aim. So in response, we want now to consider how Kierkegaard and Løgstrup might respond to this challenge. And our paper has three parts. So in the first part, we'll discuss how their conception of our dependence leads them to think that love must involve care, and thus that love must have an aim. And then in the second part, we'll discuss how they respond to the worry about encroachment. And then finally, we'll suggest briefly how this approach of love as care resolves a difficulty for the more Kantian position, namely how to account for the particularity of love. But you might be wondering at this point, why are we considering both Kierkegaard and Løgstrup? Why put those two together? Well, they can be put together because there are broad similarities in their approach and working within a similar tradition. This tradition is shaped by a Lutheran heritage in which love of the neighbor is grounded not in striving to make oneself pleasing to God, but in being liberated from self-concern through the experience of God's unearned love. In Works of Love, Kierkegaard develops this Lutheran theme in his own way, emphasizing the centrality of the God relationship for neighbor love. But Løgstrup also develops the tradition, and in a more secular way, and it's of interest to see if this can work. Section 1 then, love and dependence. Alistair MacIntyre writes, we human beings are vulnerable to many kinds of affliction, and most of us at some time are afflicted by serious ills. How we cope is only in small part up to us. It's most often to others that we owe our survival, let alone our flourishing, as we encounter bodily illness and injury, inadequate nutrition, mental defect and disturbance, and human aggression and neglect. We think the title of MacIntyre's book, Dependent Rational Animals, is a good slogan for Kierkegaard and Løgstrup's view, because they both relate love to our interdependence and mutual vulnerability. For Kierkegaard, the connectedness of neediness and love is exemplified even by Christ, love's ultimate exemplar. So here's a passage from Works of Love. So deeply is this need, that is the need to love and be loved, rooted in human nature. And so essentially does it belong to being human, that even he who was one with the Father and in the communion of love with the Father and the Spirit, he who loved the whole human race, our Lord Jesus Christ, even he humanly felt this need to love and be loved by an individual human being. He was not an ethereal figure that beckoned in the clouds without understanding or wanting to understand what humanly befalls a human being. Ah, no, he who could have compassion on the crowd that lacked food, and purely humanly, he who himself had hungered in the desert. In the same way, he could also sympathize with people in this need to love and to be loved, sympathize purely humanly. For Lögstrup, our human interdependence is woven deeply into our lives together. So here's something that Lögstrup writes in The Ethical Demand. An individual never has something to do with another human being without holding something of that person's life in their hands. It can be a very small matter, a passing mood, a dampening or quickening of the spirit, a disgust one deepens or takes away. But it may also be of tremendous significance, so that it is simply up to the individual whether the other person's life flourishes or not. Based on this interdependence, both Kierkegaard and Lögstrup argue that love for the neighbor must involve care. So if we turn first to Kierkegaard briefly to think about that connection, Kierkegaard argues that neighbor love must radically cut through all worldly distinctions of rank and esteem and respond to others as equals and as equally needy before God. It's distinctive of Kierkegaard's approach in this connection that he emphasizes the as yourself part of the command to love your neighbor as yourself. And he argues that just as proper self-love does involve care for the self, care for one's own good, so neighbor love must involve care for the neighbor's good. He refers to this as the eternal like for like kind of symmetry of caring for oneself and for the other. The care involved in proper self-love on this account, and by the same token, the care involved in neighbor love, is ultimately care with respect to a person's need for God. Lögstrup disagrees with Kierkegaard that care involves helping the person to see themselves in their own relationship to God. So he focuses, when he's discussing the Good Samaritan, he draws attention to the fact that the Good Samaritan, the focus is on physical needs rather than a spiritual issue about relationship to God. But he nonetheless agrees with Kierkegaard on the issue of interdependence. So in the case of Lögstrup, he argues that because others are dependent on us, this gives us power over them, which must be used for their good. He refers to this as the ethical demand. She specifies in the book, The Ethical Demand, in the following way: the other's life should be cared for in a way that best serves the other. In fact, rather than actually being seen as a demand, the ethical demand should be seen as a work of love and hence not as a demand at all. So to sum up, Kierkegaard and Lögstrup share the view that human beings are vulnerable and needy. And this is why, on their accounts, loving attention to the other person cannot just involve an awareness of their value, but must also involve awareness of their neediness, which then calls for a response of care. On this approach, it's fundamental rather than incidental that love involves works directed at the good of the beloved. So in the views of both Kierkegaard and Lögstrup, love does not just have an object, but also an aim. But we now need to consider the worry raised by Velleman and others about this approach, namely the problem of encroachment. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Bob.
Thanks. So beginning then first with Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard is sensitive to the encroachment worry. In works of love, the issue is articulated as a worry about arrogating for oneself the role of God for the beloved, or conversely, treating the human other as though they were God. Kierkegaard sees both tendencies, whether I'm encroaching on another or I'm allowing another to encroach on me, as fundamentally deceptive. So as he puts it in Works of Love, to love another person as God is to deceive oneself, and to allow another person to love one as God is to deceive this other person. The antidote to these defective and overreaching forms of care is for God to function as the middle term in healthy love relationships. This means seeing each other as equal and equally needy before God. And this prevents us attributing absolute rather than relative value to each other, since absolute value is instead attributed to God. This in turn prevents love relationships becoming too claustrophobic, as it were, undermining the distinction between oneself and the other in a way that can lead to encroachment. So turning then to Luckstrup, he's also highly sensitive to the encroachment worry, and he raises it explicitly himself at the end of chapter 1 of the Ethical Demand, where he asks in section 5, does the demand encourage encroachment? Addressing it there and also in chapter 2. And he accepts that this worry might seem very pressing because on his account, the ethical demand is what he calls silent. And in part, this silence means that we should not just do what the other person tells us to do. You can't, as it were, get content to the demand by just listening to the words of the other. In that sense, it's silent. You must do instead what's in their interests. So if somebody asks you for drugs, that doesn't mean to say that you should necessarily give them to them. And this is important because otherwise we're not really caring for the other, but doing what makes life easier for ourselves as it avoids any confrontation with the other, and in that sense flatters them. But then, of course, the worry is, well, why doesn't this become objectionably paternalistic? Aren't we then imposing our conception of the good on the other person? And Luckstrup makes several, I think, interesting points in response to this worry. First of all, he argues that we can assume some basic agreement on some conceptions of the good life. So, you know, if you fall down with a heart attack, I can just assume that it's okay to provide you with medical assistance. I can assume that you would want that and agree with that as a response to my situation, to your situation. But Luckstrup also accepts that your understanding of life can become what he calls an ideology, which you do then seek to impose on another person. Now, to stop this happening, he says, we need to recognize that while we have the other person's well-being in our hands, we do not have their will in our hands. Because this would be to seek to gain more power over them, rather than use the power we already have for their good. That's what we should be doing, is using the power we've got for their good, not seeking to get more power, which is what we would be doing if we imposed on our others in this way. So Luckstrup says, from this fundamental dependence and immediate power, the demand arises that we take care of that in the other person's life, which is dependent upon us and which we have in our power. However, based on the same demand, it is forbidden that we ever attempt to rob the other person of their independence, even for their own sake. Responsibility for the other person can never consist in our taking on the responsibility which is their own. Fourthly, Luckstrup allows that we cannot prevent some clashes arising over views of the good, and thus how the other should be treated. There will be disagreements about where the other's good lies. But then his response to that is that where such clashes arise, we shouldn't just assume we are in the right, but we should seek to communicate with the other person over the differences and look for consensus in a fallibilistic spirit. But again, given the first point we mentioned, we shouldn't be over-inclined to false doubts either concerning fundamental human needs and so on. So although there might be real disagreements over the good, you shouldn't generate a kind of abstract doubt that there's no possibility of agreement about the good at all. And the problem is, from Luxrup's point of view, that such doubts can then themselves be used as an excuse for inaction, as you just dither emptily about the good. So Luxrup says, there is thus the will to include them, the other person, just as there is also a will to create space for them in their relation to the norm, in order that their compliance may be voluntary. In the coming together concerning the norms, provided we do not arrogate them entirely to ourselves and refrain from using them as a guillotine with which to execute the other person, then love has its chance. So you can't dogmatically impose on the other your conception of the good. So having discussed how Kierkegaard and Luxrup can respond to the worry about encroachment, we now want to briefly close by suggesting that their view can also address a weakness in the more Kantian approach of someone like Velleman, namely, how can love be focused on an individual? The difficulty arises for Kantian views, as on this account, love as a form of respect is due to the generic value of humanity. But then it seems to lose its character of being a response to the individual in their particularity. How can the individual be the object of love on the one hand, when what is valued in them is a property they share equally with all? So somebody who puts this point quite forcefully is Nick Zangwill. He says, but that positive value that Velleman thinks love is a response to is something fundamentally generic, the same in all persons. The particularity of other people, that which makes them distinctive, plays only a facilitating role for Velleman. This seems wrong. Love is the celebration of particularity, not of what is universal and generic. Now note, we agree with Zangwill over the significance of particularity, but unlike him, we think this is compatible with some conceptions of the universal, as we're going to briefly suggest below and would be happy to discuss further. So likewise, in terms of Zangwill's worry, on a Kantian account, which involves testing maxims to see if they can hold as universal laws, the worry is that we also abstract away from individuals and so lose touch with love as a relation between one person and another. And I think it's this process of abstraction involved in the testing of maxims, as you then abstract away from the individuals you're trying to relate to, that arguably is at the root of the so-called empty formalism objections to Kantianism you find in Hegel and in others. So we think that by shifting the focus onto care rather than respect, we can answer these difficulties. So remember, on this view, we are all dependent and needy creatures, and so potential objects of care. So at one level, there are shared properties. We are all needy creatures. That's a general feature we all share. And there's also a general principle, such as love thy neighbor or Luxrup's ethical demand. So to that extent, Zangwill goes too far in rejecting universality in all its forms. However, what this love is and involves relates to the details of a particular case of need, where what it is to care for one person will differ from another, and understanding this care will require attention to them in their particularity. So there's a kind of generality at one level, but a kind of particularity that is built into it. So if we think now of Kierkegaard, Kierkegaard offers an analogy of the rich diversity of ways of flourishing in nature. It's as if even the fragile little specimen hidden among the meadow flowers had said, as Kierkegaard puts it, let me become something in myself, something distinctive. Likewise, true love loves every human being according to the person's distinctiveness. And again, our claim is that that is what comes with care. And Kierkegaard contrasts the person who loves in this gently attentive way with, for example, the rigid and domineering type who, quote, lacks flexibility, lacks the pliability to comprehend others, and demands his own from everyone, wants everyone to be transformed in his image, to be trimmed according to his pattern for human beings. Likewise, when we turn to Luckstrup, he argues that it's true that we often operate with general pictures of others and with general social norms. And to some extent, that's inevitable because we need these more general pictures and norms to make social life run more easily. But nonetheless, like Kierkegaard, he's sensitive to the worry that this might blind us to others' individual natures and their needs, leading to a kind of indifference. So for both Kierkegaard and Luckstrup, attending to the moral value of humanity in another is not just to see a value one must respect, but a vulnerable being who is in need, but on whom one must not encroach. And this, in turn, requires attending to others in their concrete particularity. So just to sum up, following Kierkegaard and Luckstrup, we've argued for the following. Given our human interdependence, neighbor love must involve an aim and not just an object. We've argued that this aim will be care, and we've also argued that this need not involve encroachment. And finally, we argued it will include an attention to the particularity of the individual that can get lost when this aim is ignored, as it is on a Kantian position like Velleman's. Thanks very much.